Hello, today is Thursday, July 18th, 2019. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. If you have a phone, you've undoubtedly received a few robocalls. You know what those are. Those calls initiated from an auto dialer that connects you with a pre-recorded message from, some politician, or asking you about getting an extended auto warranty, or just to congratulate you for those cruise tickets that you won. If you're like me, you probably don't want to receive these types of calls and have wondered if the FCC plans to do anything about it. Well, you're in luck because on today's podcast, I'm joined by Jeff Sheldon, a partner at LB3, and we're going to talk about robocalls and how the FCC plans to further control them. So, Jeff, it seems to me that even when people put their numbers on the do not call registry, they still get these annoying calls. This is a long-standing problem for consumers and for businesses. So what more can the FCC do to get this under control?
Thanks for inviting me, Joe. You're right. The Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA as we call it, was signed into law almost 30 years ago. And despite the FCC's best efforts to control robocalls, scammers now have even more technologies that they can use to trick consumers and evade the law. So the FCC is trying to encourage and empower carriers to also use new technology to proactively block robocalls.
Is this turning into electronic warfare between the carriers and the scammers?
You could say that. Scammers have ways of spoofing numbers to make the calls appear to be coming from a trusted party, like it's a number from your same local exchange or from a government agency like the IRS. The carriers are also developing algorithms to help them identify calls that fit the profile of a robocall. The problem has been one of implementation. Carriers are reluctant to block calls on a proactive basis unless the customer gives explicit consent.
I can see why a customer wouldn't want to give consent without fully understanding what calls could be blocked. And I can also see how carriers wouldn't want to block calls for fear that they'd be violating the FCC's rules.
Right. The FCC took the first steps a couple years ago by saying carriers could block calls that appear to be coming from numbers that either can't originate a call or that don't originate calls, like fax machines or numbers that have not yet been assigned to a customer.
But how would a carrier know whether a customer was using a line for a fax machine or that the number isn't used for outgoing calls?
So the rules required subscribers to opt in, except for certain numbers the carrier knows should not be originating calls, like numbers they still had in inventory and hadn't given out to a customer yet. So the FCC wants to build a new paradigm in which it would be lawful for a carrier to proactively block calls that fit the profile of a robocall unless the customer opts out of call blocking.
Don't we still have a problem with carriers blocking calls that subscribers want to receive?
That's still a concern, but there are a few new developments. First, the carriers are developing industry standards with a catchy acronym, Shake and Stir, and don't ask me right now to explain what it is, but Shake and Stir Standard, which is basically a process for the originating carrier to add authentication information to the header of each IP-based call, and that attests to the terminating carrier that the call was validly placed on the network from a known subscriber. So calls without this authenticating information would be suspect as possibly coming from a robocaller. Second, the FCC expects carriers to disclose to subscribers the kinds of calls that might be blocked and to give subscribers a simple process for opting out of call blocking. Third, and this is very important, carriers must never block calls from emergency numbers like 911 answering points. And finally, carriers must make it easy for subscribers to report erroneous call blocking or to create a whitelist of numbers that should never be blocked. For example, allowing a smartphone user to consent to receiving calls from any number in the subscriber's smartphone contact list.
So Jeff, let's assume that none of our listeners are running robocall operations. So what are the potential impacts to enterprise customers? I'm thinking specifically about whether their outbound calls could be blocked, or conversely, whether their businesses might not receive all the legitimate calls.
Okay, good questions. First, enterprise customers that have certain numbers that are never used to originate a call, think of like an inbound customer service line. The enterprise customer should ask its carrier to place those numbers on the Do Not Originate registry so that the carriers can help prevent those numbers from being spoofed. Second, certain enterprise customers should consider whether they make any calls from numbers that should be placed on a white list of what might be called critical calls that should never be blocked. And the FCC has given examples of outbound calls from 911 call centers or from schools, doctors' offices, alarm companies, numbers used to alert consumers to fraud or product recalls, numbers that have some public importance to them that you'd want to make sure that they get through to everybody that needs to get that information. The FCC's rules are still under development, so they're asking for help in defining what kinds of calls are eligible for this critical calls whitelist.
Wouldn't a whitelist of critical call numbers give spoofers a clear avenue to bypass the carrier's blocking algorithms?
Good point. And the FCC is also very concerned about that. So they're asking whether carriers should only allow critical call numbers to pass through the filter if the call was fully authenticated under that shake and stir standard. So that would also mean that the critical call must originate and terminate on IP-based networks so that the authentication header information can be passed through and acted on. The FCC is also asking if this critical call list should be kept non-public, and if so, who should have access to it, and how often should it be updated.
Now, as I recall, the full protections of the TCPA do not protect landline numbers used by business customers, thus the reason some enterprises are implementing their own filtering solutions. But the Act does apply to all wireless calls, whether it's a consumer or business. Is that right?
That's true. The TCPA provides limited legal protection to enterprise customers from receiving robocalls on landlines. However, the FCC's new rules and policies and the mechanisms being developed by carriers will, as a practical matter, cut across all voice services. Some people have estimated that about 50 billion robocalls were initiated in the U.S. in 2018, which is about 60% more than the estimate for the prior year. So it's a big problem. Robocalls are the number one complaint at the FCC, and they have made this a high priority. In fact, the FCC is setting a soft deadline for all of the major voice carriers to implement the shake and stir call authentication protocols on a voluntary basis by the end of this year.
So what happens if the carriers don't meet that year-end deadline?
Well, it's not clear whether the FCC will make it mandatory, but the FCC has asked whether it should make the protocol mandatory and whether something comparable can be implemented for legacy voice networks. So the groundwork is being established to make call authentication mandatory for all carriers over a period of time. And if you think about it, call authentication is only going to be effective if it becomes a de facto standard for all calls. Even Congress is looking at legislation to give the FCC more authority and direction to identify and clamp down on robocallers, including those that operate outside the United States.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Jeff, for providing the update. If robocalls are causing you headaches and you'd like to hear more about what's coming and what you can do, or if you have other ICT lifecycle questions, you can contact Jeff, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.